at the University of Colorado Hospital. This is our month to talk about research ethics issues as they pertain to the clinical environment. We are very pleased to have Dr. Marilyn Coors with John Heldens have put together a marvelous presentation for the ethical issues in the Moderna vaccine trials. And so I want to encourage you to put questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and raising the questions at the end. We do have one more ethics grand rounds in June. Dr. Anuj Mehta from Denver Health will be joining us to update us on ethical issues that have arisen and have been constant during the COVID pandemic. So without further pause, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Marilyn Coors.
Good afternoon, and thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us for this presentation on the how and the why of the halt in the Moderna trial vaccine. I'm going to begin introducing my faculty colleagues, John Heldens and Tom Campbell and Jose Castilla, who is with us only by video. And then Tom, they have a few slides each, but it won't be long. And then Tom will introduce our Moderna trial participants. And then we as the presenters will ask them some questions that we came up with beforehand and they have had to think about. And then Jackie will monitor all of your questions in chat and you'll have a chance to ask your questions. So we're going to be, and we'll leave time for your questions. We'll begin with John Heldens. He's going to talk about research ethics, and I'll introduce the three colleagues, John, before you begin. John is director of COMIRB Colorado Multiple Institutional Review Board and the IRB, and has been amazing during this period of COVID research. Tom Campbell was the site PI for the Moderna trial. He's professor of medicine, infectious disease, and at the Center for Global Health at Anschutz. And then Jose Castilla Mancia will join us by video, and he's associate professor of medicine and infectious disease at Anschutz, and he was a major facilitator of that trial with Tom. And then Tom will introduce our Moderna vaccine trial participants. So David, if you would share your screen, we'll let John begin with research ethics, our topic for today.
Well, thank you, Marilyn, and thank you all for joining us. It's nice to be here. It's been quite a year. So as you know, for those of you who are interested in research ethics, the three guiding principles from the Belmont report for research ethics are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And justice is the issue I think we're talking about today, but perhaps touch on all of them. And justice involves who should bear the burden of participating in research, joining a study of an investigational drug, who benefits from the approval of that drug. And so operationally, what IRBs and the NIH and FDA do, on the IRB, we consider an issue called equitable selection of subjects. That is, are you selecting the right people? Are you asking the right people to be in this study? Are you unduly putting too much burden on one element of society for the benefit of another? The NIH has policies about inclusion of women and minorities in research and inclusion across the lifespan. And the FDA has policies about enhancing diversity to get a better sense of this. Next slide. Am I frozen? No. Can
You
anybody
were for a minute, but you're back.
Okay. Next, second slide, please. There we go. So in the Belmont report, there's an interesting statement to read. This is from 1979, just to remind you all. And they say, injustice may appear in the selection of subjects, even if individual subjects are selected fairly by investigators and treated fairly in the course of research. So I just cite back to the work that IRBs do, the work that NIH does, the work that the FDA does to enhance diversity in research. And despite doing all those things, injustices do arise from our society, culturalized biases. And so even if we do all these things right, we still may end up with unjust social patterns as it involves diversity in research and who participates and who doesn't. So with that, I'll pass it on to Tom.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're getting black boxes on the screen and it's not on the right screen.
Correct.
David, can you take out the black boxes, please?
I'm not sure I see the black boxes. My screen sharing has been a little funky too, but I'll get through it.
All right, if you just move on to Tom's slides.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying.
Good.
Get there. It's been a little halting.
There you go. We still have black boxes, but it looks like that's something we're going to have to live with. So Tom, is this your first slide?
Yes, yeah. So the study we're going to talk about today is called the Moderna COVE study. This study was a phase 3 clinical trial that was intended to evaluate the safety and efficacy of the Moderna mRNA vaccine. I think as most everyone knows, this is the vaccine that is now being widely used here in Colorado and throughout the United States for preventing COVID illness. The enrollment in the Moderna COVE study began on July 27th and ended on October 23rd. So it happened very quickly. And in that fairly short period of time, over 30,000 volunteers were enrolled in the study at over 90 sites across the United States, including our site here on the Anschutz campus. Next slide, David. And this graph or this map here just shows you the sites across the United States, or the states in which people were enrolled, and the intensity of color just reflects the number of participants enrolled in each state. But you can see is that there was good geographic representation. Next slide. One of the things that was stated in the COVE protocol is, I've quoted here below, which says, given the disproportionate disease burden of COVID-19 in racial and ethnic minorities, the study will also aim to enroll a representative sample of participants from these minority populations and adjust site selection and enrollment accordingly. So this diversity in enrollment by race and ethnicity was an important objective of the protocol from the start. And if I can see if you can look at the next slide, David, this slide sort of demonstrates how diversity in enrollment occurred as the study went along. And so you see by these different colored bars and lines, the relative enrollment of non-minorities, so non-Hispanic Caucasians versus people of color. And what you can see at the left-hand part of this bar graph is that initially the majority of enrollment was in non-Hispanic Caucasians, people who were not of color, white people. And so the diversity objective was not being achieved. And at least on my screen, unfortunately, it's blocked out by a little black box. But beginning in September, around mid-September of 2020, enrollment was not completely halted, but enrollment of non-minority individuals was halted. So beginning in mid-September, only minority individuals were enrolled. And if you do see the right-hand part of this graph, you can see then that proportionally much more minority enrollment was achieved. Next slide, David. One of the things that we did here at our site was to have a outreach program for achieving diversity in our enrollment. And Dr. Jose Castillo-Mancilla, who Marilyn has already introduced, led our efforts in our community outreach. Jose couldn't be here today, so he has recorded a brief message for all of you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. I regret I'm not able to be there in person today. My name is Jose Castillo-Mancilla. I am an associate professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases here at the University of Colorado. I've been working in HIV research for over a decade. And part of my involvement in clinical studies in HIV has been to assure and promote the participation of minorities and of people of color into clinical studies. All this with the goal of making the result of these trials applicable and also generalizable to all populations. So when the Moderna study came here to our site, I partnered with our principal investigator, Dr. Thomas Campbell, to precisely do this, to extend their experience in HIV into COVID vaccine studies, and to try to target the enrollment of the populations that are mostly affected by COVID. And to do this, we performed a multi-pronged approach with three different goals. Number one is we assured that the recruitment materials that were being used for the study recruitment were sensitive and targeted towards that population. And I think that allowed us for a high impact to our audience, making the brochures and the flyers, for example, understandable both in English and in Spanish. The second strategy is that we perform a very proactive outreach to community organizations. This included, for example, the consulates of Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Peru, aiming towards the Hispanic and Spanish-speaking population that is foreign-born in the Denver metro area. We couple this with outreach to other Hispanic serving organizations, such as Servicios de la Raza, for example, Umbrella for Health, to really comprehensively target the Hispanic community. We also outreached the African American community through the Center for African American Health in Colorado, and also through CSTAR in our medical school. And we connected with the Denver Indian Health and Family Services through the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health at the School of Public Health in an institution. And I think all of the above efforts, I think were overall well received, and they really allowed us not only to inform about the study and also clarify any potential questions that could arise from vaccines, but it also helped us address any concerns in general about participation in clinical studies overall and in this particular trial. But I think most importantly, it really led to multiple additional community events to discuss not only the vaccine and concerns about vaccines and studies, but also about COVID-19 in general, and about the importance to follow recommended public health measures in our population. And I think we currently are still partnered with some of these organizations to increase vaccination rates for the vaccines that have been approved for use in the US. And I think the third important point that we did is that we try to become as present as we could in the media to disseminate our message and inform about the study. This included recurring interviews in radio, television, written media, both in English and Spanish, at the local level. We were also present in different webinars, Twitter events, Facebook Live events with the Mexican consulate, for example, to inform the community about the vaccine studies and respond to any of their concerns and questions. And also, this included dissemination of the vaccine study message to the medical community who serves people of color, to assure that they were aware of the study and that they will consider referring patients into the trial. I think this triple-pronged approach really helps as a recruitment strategy. It helped us address concerns for our most vulnerable populations, and I think ultimately led to a robust inclusion of persons of color into the Moderna study in Colorado. I'm very proud of the work we did and to have participated in the study, and I hope you continue to be safe and to get your shot if you haven't done so. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you guys soon.
Great. And so this last slide shows what the results were. It looks a little pixelated on my screen. That's more in focus now. But what you can see on the left-hand side are the national results. So nationally, the study enrolled over 30,000 volunteers. 47% were women, 25% were individuals 65 years or older, and 40% of the 30,000 were people of color, including over 6,000 Hispanics, over 3,000 African Americans, over 1,300 Asians, and 233 Native Americans. On the right-hand side, you can see the results that we had locally here at UCHealth and CUAMC, where we enrolled 217 participants, 41% women, 27% 65 and over, and 51% people of color, including 30% Hispanic, 9% African American, 3% Asian, and 15 Native Americans. So we're very pleased with that representation. None of this would have been possible without volunteers who stepped forward. And we're very fortunate today to have this discussion joined by three of our volunteers, Dr. Lisa Nguyen, Mr. Charles Nguyen, and Mr. Michael Rouse. These individuals were among the very first participants to enroll in this study here in Colorado. And it's important to think about what that was like at that time. This is roughly August of last year. And at that time, these vaccines that we now know are very safe and very effective had only been given to a few hundred people. And so Mr. Rouse, Dr. Nguyen, and Mr. Nguyen stepped forward and volunteered for this study at a time when they did not know whether or not what they were signing up for was either safe or effective. We know that now, and it's a pretty easy choice for us to make to get the vaccine, but we wouldn't be at this point, and this would not be possible if it wasn't for individuals like Mr. Rouse and the Nguyen's who stepped forward. I also want to recognize that Mr. David Weil, who's providing our AV assistance today, was also one of those very early volunteers. With that, I think we can move into our discussion.
All right, I'll kick off the questions today with a question that actually was provided by Lisa Nguyen. And so I'm going to start with her. Lisa, could you speak to how your community or communities feel about the vaccine?
I think in general, now that the vaccine has been approved, people are much more open to receiving it. There's certainly a lot of background for minorities in terms of our relationship with the healthcare system and trials in the past. Many of us are aware of what happened with the syphilis Tuskegee experiment and kind of how poorly Black people were treated during that study, or lack thereof. And so I think as we were getting ready to go into the study, those questions came up certainly as to whether or not it was safe to participate in a vaccine. Now that it's been approved, most people I know have elected to receive the vaccine.
Charles, do you want to add to that? And then we'll move on to Michael.
For me, I think it was the same thing. As a layperson who doesn't work in healthcare, I knew of the study. It wasn't exactly my generation by any means, but to Lisa's point, it was a question, right? Is how do we know at this stage if it's okay to take this? So I raised it, but Dr. Campbell graciously gave perspective on that, which was helpful.
All right, we'll move on to Michael. Michael, could you speak to how your communities feel about the vaccine? Michael was #1 participant in the trial, and David Weil, who's running the show, was #4. So we're very fortunate to have these early participants.
Well, in general, I personally couldn't wait to be involved in the program. I contacted NIH in July, and when I didn't hear anything a few weeks later, I actually contacted NIH and spoke to a researcher who put me in touch with Dr. Campbell. And that was on August 16th. So Dr. Campbell called me immediately, got me in, and the rest was history. As for how the community feels, I think, the African-American community is very diverse. There's a lot of different feelings on the vaccine. One of the biggest things that I've run into, and I'm actually working with the Colorado Vaccine Equity Task Force. And one of the things that I've run into, even with my own family, is they weren't so much concerned about what happened in the past as they were about the small test group. In other words, the 30,000 people we used in phase 3, half of which received it and half didn't. They wanted to wait to see what the results were going to be. And I think that was probably pretty common among all people, is that, once we started pushing the vaccine out to the general population, some people on the sidelines were waiting to see what happened, So right now, I think people are more willing to take the vaccine after 100 million doses plus have been, distributed. I don't see as much resistance in the African-American community as I did in the beginning. But of course, here again, we're dealing with a diverse population opinions, and you still have people who have religious reasons, political reasons they don't want to take the vaccine. So I think moving along.
That's great news. John and Tom, do you want to jump in with some other questions?
Yeah, I will. Michael, can you elaborate on why you were so eager to join the trial?
Well, as the virus started picking up speed in June, July, and being a non-medical person, and I do want to thank all of you, the medical professionals who risked their lives to save other people, I was thinking, what can I do? I was a computer person. I had no medical background, but I wanted to contribute to helping resolve this issue. And the way I saw it is the best way I could contribute was to get involved with the phase 3 testing to help move this along, because we were all getting tired of it and we all wanted to have some results. So I never thought about the risk involved. I just wanted to get involved. So that's why I stepped up. And I personally felt, and I think I was on the news quite a bit in August and September, I felt that it was, kind of my social responsibility to everyone in our society to get involved.
Lisa and Charles, do you have reflections on why you chose to get involved?
I
They
wish
really weren't in the target age group, so that makes it even more interesting.
I wish I had the same level of social commitment that Michael had at the time. My experience was different. I just got an email, saying, "Hey, would you be interested in participating?" I deleted the email. And then I mentioned it to my wife, who made it very clear how that was a wrong way of looking at this. And I think I was just coming from a place of like, it was, kind of like Michael was just mentioning, that it's too soon. I'm very, very excited that we're making this, this progress, but I'll wait until, until some other folks have proven the efficacy of it. That was kind of my perspective on it. And then she can tell her experience, but the passion that she had about saying, no, this is important, and the idea of being involved in it, and quite honestly, awakening some of those, social responsibility perspectives that Michael alluded to, came from just talking with Lisa that night at dinner, and then it was cemented after having the conversation with Dr. Campbell, where, I felt like I had a unique perspective because I am a layperson. I work in technology, but I'm married to a doctor. So I can see it from her perspective, but I could also bring kind of just what I think, quite honestly, a lot of lay people may think about this, or at least at that time. So the fact that Dr. Campbell, when the three of us talked, was able to talk to Lisa in a way where I may have gotten only like 60% of the conversation, but then talk to me directly in a way that addressed what I was concerned about, was very, very important for me. So, so that was my experience in terms of how I thought about it initially, and then kind of shifted to be excited to participate.
Yeah. I think my experience was similar to Michael's in that I was really excited to participate. We knew that the trials were coming to Colorado. I work at Highlands Ranch Hospital. I'm an OB-GYN, so I'm not on the front lines really of COVID. We do have some COVID patients, but I'm not in the ICU and I'm not in the emergency department. So this was something that I could do to help participate. And I know it's important that we have adequate representation across all ethnic groups that are going to receive any medication or any vaccination. So it's important to make sure that we get adequate enrollment so we know that it works and it's safe for everybody. And so I was happy to encourage Charles to participate, and happy that Dr. Campbell let me join as well.
So Marilyn, do I have the next question?
Sure.
Well, so let me ask Michael. So Michael, obviously we've mentioned the potential risk of joining a trial with a vaccine that we did not know whether it was safe or effective. But I think it's important to also recognize that joining a trial has other commitments. And so you and other participants had to come here to the Anschutz campus for in-person visits. You had to let us stick swabs deep in your nose and collect extra blood specimens. Can you talk about what, in addition to getting the shots in the shoulder, so can you talk about what the experience was like for you in participation in the trial as the trial proceeded?
Well, thanks to you, we did go over the informed consent. So I was aware of the risk. And, I spoke to my wife. She just increased the insurance policy. So, but, and I committed to 25 months and I intend to stay in it for 25 months. And in January of this year, we found out once the unveiling took place that I actually did get the vaccine instead of the placebo. But the whole process has been very good. I mean, I'm used to taking lots of vaccinations. I used to work on a cruise ship. I used to travel all over the world. So I've had to have quite a few vaccines, yellow fever and the works. So I didn't see it as a big deal. And, the fact that the phase 1 and phase 2 people really spearheaded this, and there were no serious issues there, I felt fairly comfortable that being in phase 3, I wasn't going to run into any serious issues. And as you know, Dr. Campbell, I was one of the few people that had a reaction. I had 7 of the 17 symptoms. And initially, I didn't know what was happening, but then it was like 5 hours after I got my first shot, I said, it's probably the vaccine. And within 12 hours, it had disappeared. When I got my second vaccine on September 20th, I had the similar symptoms that were more intense and lasted about 24 hours. But most people I know have very few symptoms. My wife's taken it. I think she had a sore shoulder. That was it. But that's all part of the trials, collecting data and documenting the symptoms. So I wasn't really concerned about, dying or anything.
Good. We didn't want any participants to die. I'll take the next question because I've been wondering about this. Why did you trust the trial, the science in the trial? You've mentioned phase 3, but why did you trust it? Really, we didn't know anything back there in August, and you took all of those risks that were elucidated in the informed consent form. So why did you trust it? And did your family and friends have the same trust that you did? And we'll start with the Wynn family.
I think it comes down to the phase 1 and phase 2 data. Like Michael said, there were no significant adverse outcomes with those groups. And while they're small, that gives you a sense that it's probably going to work and be safe. And we just need to verify that in the phase 3 trial. So I didn't feel like there was anything significantly concerning that hadn't, obviously it was still a small sample size initially, but I felt comfortable. And also, like Michael said as well, going through the informed consent page by page with Dr. Campbell was very helpful. And there were a lot of details and opportunities to leave the trial if you didn't feel that you were comfortable participating anymore. And we certainly, when we signed up, agreed to 25 months until January, when I found out I had received the placebo and needed to get vaccinated for work. So I'm no longer in the trial, but I do have the Moderna vaccine. And as far as family, I think there was some hesitancy, but my aunt also joined the trial. So I think we are open to things.
Yeah, and for me, once we had the conversation with Dr. Campbell and I started to research it, quite honestly, it's science, right? So I trust science. It became very easy to realize that, the questions, which again, from a layperson's perspective, I think they're reasonable questions. Like, this happened so fast. That's never happened before. How did that happen? Well, you do a little research, you could see science. Doctors are amazing. Science is amazing. And I say that because I think from a layperson's perspective, with what we've seen, the whole politicized nature of this has hurt the cause of just having the science speak to where we're at and have that be the kind of the tip of the spear for how we navigate through this. And I think that's a disservice to the work that everyone has done. And the fact that those questions were able to be answered for why it was developed so quickly and kind of where we're at made it easier for me to say, okay, yeah, I'm all in. And I am still in the trial. I look forward to participating through the 25 months. And, my whole attitude on this has changed to the point where I just feel like we're almost like a part of history, a very, very small part of, in terms of what I'm doing. But the effort to get us fully out of this, I feel is an inflection point for the importance of vaccines and where we're going in the future. So the idea that I was a part of it on that level is actually kind of exciting. So that's kind of how my attitude has changed.
So it sounds like the issues that you've raised that helped you to trust were the information that you received and having your questions answered. And also trust in the scientific method, politics aside. How about you, Michael?
Well, I feel the same way. Once I got involved, I started doing a lot of research on mRNA and found that it's been around for about 30 years in a different application, of course. But being in computer science and being a scientist myself to some degree, I trust in science. And that's one of the things I emphasized in a lot of my news interviews over and over, is that we have to have faith in science. I mean, we have to have faith that these solutions are going to help humankind, I guess you could say. And somebody has to be first. Not that I was first, but I mean, I was first in Colorado, but you know, we've had a lot of people in phase 1 and 2 that really stuck their necks out. And as mentioned before, there were no deaths. So by the time it hit phase 3, it was pretty stable. I mean, nobody knew all the reactions that were going to occur, or that, you know, if somebody who had some significant medical issue was going to, you know, pass away. But, you know, fortunately that didn't happen. And I think, you know, the faith that a lot of us in the phase 3 has paid off. You know, it's allowed the EUA to be pushed out ahead of time. I mean, it still has to be authorized by the FDA, but, you know, we've seen that with the EUA, it's really cut down on the deaths of people dying from COVID. It really has helped.
Tom, could you comment briefly about what enabled this to be so speedy?
In terms of the conducting the trial or the whole vaccine process?
Conducting the trial.
Yeah, so.
And I guess both, but mostly conducting.
Yeah, so in what enabled the trial to happen so quickly, I think I would point to 2 things. One, there was tremendous community support for the effort. And that, you know, locally here on the Anschutz campus, there was tremendous support from the university and from UCHealth. And in the community level, there were volunteers like Charles and Lisa and Michael, who, you know, who found us and stepped forward for this. So we had no problems enrolling people as fast as we could. So enrollment went very fast. The second thing I would point to is that in order to get to the answer about whether or not the vaccine worked, what was necessary was for there to be a certain number of COVID infections during the trial. The planned number was roughly about 145, if I remember right. And that happened much faster than anyone thought it would. And that was because the trial enrolled in the period, as I said, from July through October. And then in November and December, this country was hit with a huge wave of COVID illness. And because of that, the number of COVID illness and infections that was necessary to get to the answer happened very quickly. In answer to your question about the whole vaccine effort, there's a lot of things that made it happen. One is the messenger RNA technology that both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines use. That was able to be developed much faster. If we were still waiting on the traditional, you know, if we were going to just rely on the traditional protein-based technology, we still would not have an authorized vaccine in this country. So number one was the technology. Number two was the organized and orchestrated effort to make things happen faster. So people may have heard of Operation Warp Speed, and that was a design program by the government to compress the timeline for vaccine development. And I use the word compress because it didn't cut anything out. It just took all of the existing pieces and made them happen in a shorter period of time. So I think those would be the main things that I would point to.
Thank you. John, do you have a last question before we turn it over to Jackie for our participants' questions, our audience's questions?
No, let's let the audience ask questions.
All right, Jackie.
So the first set of questions are both to do with long-term outcomes. So the first question is, this is a trial for 1 year. When will you publish additional information about long-term outcomes? And the second is, how will the long-term follow-up contribute to the full approval by the FDA? So what happens to the long-term outcome data?
So I guess that's a question for me.
Yes.
The trial is still ongoing. It is planned to be a 25-month trial, so it's actually over 2 years of follow-up. All of the participants in the trial have been unblinded, and the participants who received placebo in the trial were offered a vaccine through the trial. So everyone at our site who is still on the trial has been vaccinated. And in doing so, by continuing to follow participants, even though everyone has been vaccinated, we can still gather long-term safety data, and we can also assess the durability of vaccine protection. And those things will be important, and those data will be published as they are available. Moderna has the published data on 6-month durability of antibody levels. And as we progress and we get to the 1-year point, we'll be seeing more data come from that. In all of this, all of the long-term data, in addition to the short-term data, and as well as the data that very rich data that are now available from the 260 million people who have been vaccinated with either Moderna or Pfizer across the country. As those data become available, those are the data that will be used to get the final approval for the vaccine.
Any idea about timeline, Tom?
No, I don't. I would anticipate, sometime later this year, but I can't tell you anything more precise than that.
Okay, and another question has to do with the decision to unblind the trial, weighing the obligations to these first volunteers to get early access against the usefulness of using the placebo for as long as you can to improve the data about both safety and efficacy?
Yeah, that's, I think, a very good question. And it is a question that was discussed a lot. There was a lot of discussion between Moderna, the National Institutes of Health, and investigators like myself who were conducting the trial. And I think that what it came down to is that we felt a very strong obligation to individuals like Mr. Rouse and the Winds who stepped forward to volunteer for this trial. And once we knew that the vaccine was both safe and effective from the data that we had in hand in early to mid-December, we felt that it was more important to offer the vaccine to the participants rather than to continue to collect placebo-controlled data. So we put the health of individual participants ahead of the broader scientific goal of placebo-controlled data.
Okay, before I lose this very first question about when we're getting to the point of mandating vaccines, and I saw Julie Swaney in the participants, what religions would prohibit vaccinations? Julie, if you're still on, David, can we unmute Julie to answer that or put the answer in the chat? Or maybe Tom or John or anyone would know that answer? I don't know of any religions that would prohibit vaccination, but I'm a philosopher. Tom or John, anyone?
I expect Christian Scientists, but
You know, what I'm not that well versed in various religions. I think what I've heard from discussion with patients is concerns about whether fetuses are used in development of vaccines. Right. And so that's been an issue that has been raised. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, the vaccine itself is made in the laboratory without any type of cell or fetal derived tissue or other components. In the early testing of the vaccine, a cell line that had been derived 50 years ago from fetal tissue was used to generate SARS-CoV-2 virus-like particles that were then used to test the antibody response to the vaccine. So only in a very indirect way was there any connection to fetal tissue.
And one question about what was the p-value at the time of unblinding?
It's published in the New England Journal of Medicine in mid-December, so I can't quote it to you offhand.
Okay, but it was good to get published.
It was.
Okay. How would the outcome, long-term outcome follow-up address these new variants?
Well, we've had a wide surge of new variants that began in the United States in January. Now over 70% of all new infections, both in the United States and over 80% of new infections in Colorado, are caused by variants that have mutations that could potentially decrease the efficacy of the vaccine. And so by following our participants, like Mr. Rouse and Mr. Nguyen, we can monitor them to see if infections with these variants occur and thereby assess how well the vaccines are working against them.
Is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine an mRNA vaccine?
No, the Johnson & Johnson / Janssen vaccine is a adenovirus vector vaccine. And what that means is that the genetic information for the coronavirus spike protein is coded by a small piece of DNA that's packaged in an adenovirus shell. Adenoviruses are a common cause of the common cold and things that we're exposed to all the time. And that adenovirus shell is what's injected as the vaccine.
So one participant wants to know, what about including individuals with disabilities in the trials? People who have mobility, hearing, vision impairments. And I noticed that David put in that he participated because he has type 1 diabetes and he wanted to know the impact. What kind of variables are you able to speak to?
So the trial I didn't go into all the details of the inclusion criteria for the trial, but the trial, number one, did not exclude anyone because of disability. It did exclude people who were immunosuppressed. So we did not have information, we do not have good information about how well the vaccine works in people who may be immunosuppressed because of cancer treatments or organ transplantation. But the trial did specify that at least 25% of the enrollees would either be 65 or over or have a chronic medical condition, including things like diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease.
And Dr. Nguyen and Dr. Campbell, what would you tell patients with strong concerns that the vaccine negatively impacts fertility? Also, concerns for children getting the vaccine. What would you tell people?
Well, since Dr. Nguyen specializes in women's health, I'll let her take this question first.
Sure. The American College of OBGYN and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine have all come out and said there is no evidence that there's any impact on fertility. In the mouse models, there was no evidence that it impacted fertility for those mice. And we've had several patients who have conceived within a couple of weeks of receiving either their first or second vaccination. So there's really no evidence that's credible that it impacts fertility. In terms of children, you can look at the 12 to 15-year-old data, and it's 100% effective in the Pfizer arm. So I think it's great. And there's, when you think about how the vaccine works and how I explain it to my patients, is that you're given a little bit of information to tell your body to make the spike protein, and then your body responds to that. It doesn't cross the placenta, it doesn't change your DNA, and it's metabolized very quickly, and you mount an appropriate immune response. And that's it. We have so many years of experience with other vaccinations that we can't look back on and say, well, you got the polio vaccine and now you have some weird side effect. And not all of our vaccinations are made the same way. And we still have a lot of safety data.
Have you monitored the effect on patients with MS, for example?
So we do not have data from the clinical trials on patients with MS. There are data that are coming out now as the vaccine is being given in practice to people with MS, as well as other conditions that have to be treated with immunosuppressing agents. So far, the vaccine appears to work well in those groups and be just as safe as it is for everyone else. I'd also like to just add one other comment about the fertility question. And just to reemphasize what Dr. Nguyen said, there's absolutely no evidence that these vaccines impair fertility. And in fact, in the Moderna trial, even though women were required to use contraception, there were pregnancies. And the rate of pregnancy was exactly the same in the placebo arm as well compared to the vaccine arm. So the vaccine did not impair fertility in the trial participants.
So the July 9th UCHealth news release said that the trial here would enroll 1,000 participants. What led to the difference between that number and the 200 ultimately enrolled?
It was the pace of enrollment nationally. So the trial stopped enrollment at all the sites once the 30,000 mark was reached. And we enrolled participants at our site as fast as we humanly could and as we could do safely. And at that pace, when nationally the 30,000 mark was reached, we were at 217, so that's when we stopped.
John, you have a question for our panelists?
Yeah, I don't get to speak with participants very often. So Michael, I'm curious if you have any advice for other people considering joining research after your experience?
I think it's a very personal decision you have to make. And I'm kind of a risk taker in general. So, I think it's just a matter of how you personally feel about getting involved in any kind of research. There is always the possibility it could end in, you could become ill or, end in death or, those possibilities always exist in any kind of new research. So it's a personal decision. I would continue to take part in research. And this was the first research I've ever done in my life. But I had, again, I had very little concerns. And, we're in a worldwide pandemic. We need all hands on deck. And, people have to step up at certain times if they're comfortable.
Thank you. Charles or Dr. Nguyen, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree 100%. I do think it's personal, but I just feel like there is a strong need for communication, almost like a campaign about, just educating the public so that they can make an informed decision. I think there are concerns about where people get information. I work for a technology startup, so I know exactly what social media can do, both for the positive side as well as the negative side. So I think, if people have proper information to make that personal decision, I just think they'll make a better decision. I think there'll be a higher level of participation just because of that. But yeah, that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah. This wasn't the first trial that I participated in. I've participated in phase 3 trials before. And I think it's something that I personally feel is I can contribute. So I can roll up my sleeve, or I can take a medication if it's something that I think will help other people. And selfishly, it's something that I wanted for myself. I wanted a vaccine because I'm a healthcare provider, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it was terrifying to go to work, especially in April and May, and have no idea how bad things were going to get. And you would see all these news reports from other places, New York, Italy, et cetera. And it was terrifying. So I wanted to help get us to the end.
Do you agree that the good point about social media and the news media, that does carry lots of stories about concerns about conspiracy theories and microchips? Mm-hmm. How widespread is that?
I've certainly heard it. I've had a few patients bring it up to me, and my response is, we all carry a cell phone with us, so we're already being tracked by many things, by many apps. Yeah. So I don't think that anybody needs to inject a microchip in somebody if you're voluntarily going to carry a phone with you.
That's a good response. So that's all the, someone has another response?
No, I was just going to give a perspective. I have some friends that work, as I said, I work in technology. I have friends that work at some of the major social media firms, and just internally, obviously they could never speak about this, but the percentages of false information that is still out there is prodigiously high. Mm-hmm. Because the platforms are monetized for the amount of time people spend on the phone. And unfortunately, human nature seems to suggest that we're more interested to read and focus on, the fires and the chaos and the conspiracy theories, instead of just apparently boring science or truth. So I, in some cases I've heard it's like 40%.
Wow.
And I just want to add that I think people just have to use a little bit of common sense too, I mean, this tracking thing, you get in a car that has GPS, every intersection you go through has video cameras. I mean, once you leave your house, and even in your house, you're being tracked. So the last thing they would need to do is put a tracking molecule in the vaccine.
So that's all the questions from our participants. I just want to thank Dr. Coors and Dr. Campbell and Dr. Nguyen and Charles and Michael and John for this amazing presentation. Please join us again in June, June 10th for Dr. Anuj Mehta and continuing and new ethical issues in the COVID pandemic. Thank you all very much for a very insightful and informative session on research ethics.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, especially to our panelists and participants.